All right, JPG with MP James Moore. How are you?
I'm well.
So we wanted to ask you the Darcy Clark Allan Schoenborn issue. Why is it so important for you to raise it so publicly?
Well, because I think this is a case that's gotten such high profile because it confirms everybody's worst fears about the justice system, which is that the victim is nowhere. It's all about lawyers, it's about the criminals, it's about process, and the victims are just sort of forgotten. And what Darcy Clark went through, not only in the immediate fact of the crime, but the fact that the system would say to her that her ex-husband who murdered her children could be released into the community without her consent, without her knowing about it, without the community knowing about it, and that she would have to every year, she would have to relive the horror of what happened to convince a panel of bureaucrats that this guy shouldn't be allowed back into the community is just a massive failure of the system. On top of which, the BC review panel didn't even know that she lived in the community into which he might have been released for day passes. It just strikes everybody as something that's fundamentally wrong. And Darcy Clark has been victimized more than enough, more than anybody should ever have to experience in their lifetime. And the fact that the system victimized her again is something that needs to be corrected.
So you mentioned, if we need to legislate common sense, we need to legislate common sense. Because when I hear that, I interpret that the justice system isn't doing their job, the psychiatrists, the court system, in terms of evaluating and not finding him criminally responsible. So do you still feel he is not criminally responsible? And when you say
No, I get your point. Look, if somebody's been determined to be not criminally responsible, but they still committed the act, there is legislation, for example, in 20 U.S. states where basically they say, okay, maybe you don't go into a jail, and maybe you're treated differently. Maybe you go into an institution or into some kind of a hospital, but you're certainly not released back into society. You're not released back into community, and you don't have day passes, and you certainly should never, ever have the possibility of having a day pass access to a park or to a mall without the victim's consent, without consideration of the impact on the family, and without consulting the community. So the system is clearly so weighted towards the criminal, and the victim is nowhere in the process, that this is something that needs to be fixed. So what I said is, if we have to legislate common sense being that the victim should be brought into the process, and what's in their interest should be at the center of the system, then that's something that we'll legislate.
Do you find that, raising this publicly, that you've actually put Allan Schoenborn, who's part of escorted day pass is part of his rehabilitation, of which he would have rights. Do you feel that by raising that anxiety with the community, you'd be putting him at risk if he does get out into the community?
No, look, I'm far from the catalyst of this. I think the public is outraged. The public is outraged at this entire scene from beginning to end, and it didn't start with me, and it's not going to end with me. And by raising the profile of this one particular case, there's a greater good that we can accomplish, which is that the tragedy that's befallen Darcy Clark, not only by Allan Schoenborn, but on top of that by the system, should never be visited upon anybody else, ever. So we will take this opportunity to raise the profile of this case, not only within the community, but across the province and hopefully across the country, so that when Parliament returns, if I'm the Member of Parliament, that when Parliament returns, that people will be aware of this issue, will be aware of the failure of the system, and we'll work together to fix the system, because this can't happen to anybody else.
So in your plan, or the Conservative platform, there's an expansion of prisons. Now, some people say that crime rate is going down, and I've talked to some forensic psychologists that say prisons aren't necessarily needed.
Yeah.
And with the context of the Ashley Simpson case, where a 19-year-old who'd committed suicide in prison, and now there's an inquiry into that whole process.
Yeah.
Where do we... I guess my question is, how can there be an expansion of prisons prior to that inquiry with her being in the prison system?
Well, the issues are separate, and obviously there is an inquiry into Ashley Smith, and what we know in the papers, from reading the papers, is the limited amount of what we know. It seems on the surface obviously to be a tragic circumstance, and that shouldn't be something that we ought not learn from. But that said, going forward, yes, we've invested money to build a few new prisons, but also to improve, I believe it's 32 other prisons, because we have correction staff who are being assaulted, we have correction staff whose safety is not taken into account, and we're not just building prisons, we're building facilities to separate those in society who play by the rules from those who don't. And if that's what's required, then we're going to build those facilities. But also within those institutions, we also have, it's funny that people on the left always talk about how we have to have jails and facilities that make sure that we have the kind of training or refocusing criminals so that they can have some kind of skill or social capacity to reintegrate back into society. Well, where do you think that's going to happen? It's going to happen within institutions and within jails. So we need to build those institutions and jails so that we can have those kinds of programs and have those kinds of supports so that when somebody, particularly nonviolent criminals, are released back into society, that they have those kind of basic structures and boundaries and capacities to reintegrate back into civilized society. You have to have the institutions to do that. So to say we want to have all these programs and we want to help criminals reintegrate into society and not build the institutions that are required to make that happen is to debate against yourself. We believe in building the institutions where they're needed, upgrading the old institutions to make sure they're safe for the staff that are working there, and to make sure that criminals have a clear place to be until they're prepared to reintegrate back into society and to participate properly in civilized society.
So how can there be an expansion of prisons prior to the federal inquiry regarding the Ashley Smith case, which is about mental health in the prison system? Because again, that's
the two issues are not sister together. It's not we can't stand around and not improve our existing institutions because we're waiting for the Ashley Smith inquiry to wrap up and to make recommendations. Certainly, it'll wrap up. There will be recommendations. There will be things that will be learned from there. But these issues are not mutually inclusive. Like you don't arrest the responsibility of the state to build these institutions to fix the existing ones while we wait for the inquiry to finish. These are two issues that ought not be jammed together, and that's not appropriate policy making if that's how people think we should approach things.